So good afternoon, everybody. I'm so grateful you're here. I'm also going to try to speak slowly because I'm very grateful that I don't have to be translated. That's the remarkable thing about teaching in Holland. So thank you. If I say a word or use a term that you don't understand, just raise your hand, and I'm happy to elaborate. So I'm not dressed as a Buddhist today. I'm dressed as the kind of person that goes into medical schools, which I do all over the United States and in Asia, and present material to clinicians who are very conservative and not at all interested in Buddhism, but to people who are having quite a difficult time, whether they know it or not. And I presume that not everybody here is a card-carrying Buddhist, but I'd be kind of interested to know who of you, do have a meditation practice. Would you just put your hand up? Oh my goodness, I was wrong. Okay, I take it back. I should have worn my Buddhist samoe. That's a little intimidating, actually. If I asked that, I wouldn't ask that question in a medical school. I can assure you I would have no hands or very few. Excuse me. So I want to just tell you a little bit about myself. My own upbringing was not so religious, but of course I was brought up in a family that did have a church background. So, Christianity is my so-called root religion. But because of the world that I grew up in, which was the South, very conservative environment, I was saying to the people in the retreat that I was raised in a community where not only Jews were not permitted to live, but also Catholics were not permitted to live. I know that's something, the Second World War was a powerful manifestation of violent exclusion. And also the world that I grew up in was characterized by exclusion, of course not as extreme as in Europe. But it was because of that experience, my own life opened up in a couple of areas. One, as Letitia mentioned, I was very sick as a child and couldn't see, so my family brought in an Afro-American woman to take care of me, whose mother had been a slave. And her ethos, her view, her spirit was really important in terms of the healing process that I went through, but also in terms of the values that blossomed inside of me. And those values were very much related to what it is to be a free person. What it is not only be a slave of society, but also to be a slave of your views, of how you see the world. And it was in the 1960s that I had the opportunity to hear some talks and read literature in the midst of the civil rights movement, very inspired by Martin Luther King, and in the midst of the anti-war movement in the United States, that really my life broke open because what happened for me was, as a young person, I was deeply socially engaged. I was in my 20s during the 1960s. You remember what that was like in Amsterdam, some of you. Wow, in America too. And at the same time, we had a set of issues in our country. We were fighting a war in Asia that just seemed insane to young people. And we were also engaged in oppressive policies and behaviors in relation to people of color. In fact, the racism in our country was so deep, and I was brought up in a racist world. So my feeling of aversion toward my society was profoundly deep. And when I first began to pay attention to Buddhism, I had this realization that this was about how we train our heart and mind. That it was a way for a medium, if you will, that was not so much about religion, but it was about mental training. It was how we change the mind. And so began this path for me in the mid-1960s of practice, but also understanding that changing the mind was essential if you were engaged in any activities related to ethics and social transformation. And so although I've been involved for now many decades in social transformation and in social service, I feel that actually individuals who aren't directly involved in social transformation or social service are in fact involved in social transformation and social service. Whether we're a parent or a student, whether we're a cab driver, whether we're sweeping the halls of a hospital, whether we're a clinician or a chaplain, a psychologist, whatever, or a business person, whatever our role is in society, be it a homemaker or be it a policymaker, we have deep responsibilities to effectuate, both in terms of socially and in terms of environmentally. And particularly, as I said during the retreat, our attention has been co-opted by the media in a way that disallows us to often refer back to very deep values. You know, as a result, I think of the era in which I was born, which was during the Second World War, so I was a war baby. That's what they call us in my country. Then, you know, experiencing the 60s, and then Buddhism, and then being an academic, working in university settings and teaching in university settings, but just feeling something in my own psyche was not simply about the ivory tower of the university environment, but it had to do with all of life. How we take responsibility in terms of the kind of structural violence that we see our governments and corporations fomenting in the world, and how we take responsibility also in terms of the very intimate acts that we engage in, whether it's turning the lights out when we leave a room, shutting the water off when we're brushing our teeth, understanding that everything is connected to everything else. So today's talk, though it will focus on the work that I've done in healthcare settings, now since 1970, so that's some 45 years of this work. But also I want you to take the content that I'm sharing with you and bring it, you know, into how it applies to your life. That it's not simply just for people who care for dying people, but it's also for all of us, you know, in how we look at issues related to the deep stressors that we encounter in our lives today, how we also consider empathy to be, compassion to be, and how we actualize compassion in our lives. And I mentioned this during the retreat, and I just want to mention it again very briefly. You know, my own work in the end-of-life care field came in part from the very deep existential questions that are explored in the context of Buddhist practice. But it really came alive in the experience of watching my grandmother die in a very unfortunate way, and the vow that I made to her upon the last moments that I saw her to try to change the way people died in Western culture. Yeah, so that's that. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to take you through a presentation. Hopefully we'll activate here in a minute. And this is kind of wild. I was in Japan in April and at a small science meeting that was put together for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so I was asked to actually, because I have so many connections in Japan, if I would present my work on compassion. And I blithely said, oh, well, certainly. But I have to tell you, sitting up on the stage across from the Dalai Lama, presenting compassion was really kind of... But I will tell you, I did remain calm in spite of it all. But it was pretty strange. So I wanted to actually share what I shared with him in this meeting. It was a meeting produced by the Mind and Life Institute, because I think it's of interest to what we're doing today, and it will take us through quite a bit of content in a condensed way. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but this is for your students so that they have this opportunity. And what we want to explore is compassion. And I want to read the words of one of my students, Dr. Gary Pasternak, who is an extraordinary clinician who's medical director of Mission Hospice in San Francisco and also part of our Nomads Clinic in the Tibetan Plateau in Nepal. And this is when he was working as a fellow at San Diego Hospice. And he wrote me this in an email, and I asked him if I could share it. And he says, I'm up late admitting patients to the inpatient hospice unit. Just when I think I'm too old for these late nights, without sleep, a person in all their rawness, vulnerability, and pain lays before me, and my hands explore the deep wounds in her chest, and my ears open to her words. My heart cracks open once again. And this night, a sweet 36-year-old woman with her wildly catastrophic breast cancer speaks of her acceptance and her hope for her children. And she speaks with such authenticity and authority. And her acceptance comes to me as the deepest humility a person can experience. And then again, once again, I remember why I stay up these late nights and put myself in the company of the dying. So I want us to explore what is compassion and what are some of the challenges to compassion. And this is compassion not only in the healthcare setting, but in working with our children, being a teacher in a school, serving as a chaplain in the prison system, working with homeless people, working with those who are addicted, and of course working with those who are very ill. And I want to speak very briefly about how compassion is trained in conventional settings, and then to look at an actual map of compassion, a heuristic map of compassion, that I believe will begin to open up how we train others in compassion, and then an actual intervention and a consideration of compassion's future. So my contention has been that one cannot teach other people compassion. But that has not always been what I thought to be the case. What I've seen is many programs in various settings, not just Buddhist programs, programs that are in medical settings and so forth, that have endeavored to teach compassion. But a number of questions came up for me in this exploration about what we mean by compassion and how we train compassion. And what I recognized very simply is that compassion is actually a system. It's a system that's comprised of non-compassion elements. And those non-compassion elements include attention and affect, insight and intention, and embodiment and engagement. And let me just say, for those of you taking notes, I've written peer-reviewed journal papers which are accessible, so don't feel, that you have to write everything down. Not to worry. And this work has come out of 45 years of working in the end-of-life care field, many decades of training caregivers and clinicians in contemplative approaches to care of people with catastrophic illnesses. It's also come out of neuroscience and social psychology. I've been involved with the Mind and Life Institute from its very inception. And as a result of that, I've had the great privilege of interacting with scientists, both social scientists and neuroscientists, over many decades in mapping, doing neural mapping, and of discovering aspects of how the brain and mind operate. And then, of course, I've been deeply influenced by Eastern perspectives on compassion and the mind. So I want to just very simply parse compassion into some features which I think are important. We can say it involves the capacity to actually attend to the experience of others. And that capacity is often very limited for individuals because we live in a world where our attention has been co-opted. Whether you're a clinician walking down the hall with your iPhone, your beeper, with the PA system going off, with people, sort of grabbing onto you, or just in daily life, how our devices, our iPhones and Blackberries and whatever devices we have are constantly attracting our attention. So one of the most important features to develop in the stream that we call compassion is the capacity to really attend. Just as you're attending to be now, in an undivided way, most of you, when you find your attention drifting off to, proliferation of thoughts or whatever, just notice and see if you can bring yourself back to my words. A second feature of compassion that's really important is the capacity to actually feel concern for others. And when I distinguish between empathy and compassion, you'll begin to get some idea of why the experience of concern is really important. And then to sense into what will serve others, and then potentially to be of service. This is very different from empathy, as you will see shortly. So I want us to look together then into the example of compassion in the healthcare setting, particularly in caring for dying people. And why this, I think, is important for all of us is because in one way or another, whether it's our own diagnosis or working with relatives and friends, we will encounter death. There is no question. So our work in the healthcare setting is about relieving what Dame Cicely Saunders calls the total suffering of others. And this is not only the physical and mental suffering, but also the social suffering, the relational suffering, the spiritual suffering, as well as the economic suffering that people who are gravely ill encounter. And then, of course, as clinicians, it's very important for us to be with the truth of the suffering of the family and friends of people who are profoundly ill. And then, as clinicians, it's essential that we address the truth of suffering among caregivers who are professionals. And so often, this is what we encounter in the ICU, a kind of tube-entangled world. And needless to say, encountering this kind of scene too often has a very dramatic effect on caregivers. And in my country, physicians experience a very high level of stress. I don't know what the statistics are here in Holland, but it is said in our country from various research projects that approximately 60% of physicians in the United States report symptoms of burnout. And of course, burnout is related to lower quality of care. And in fact, it can occur very early on in medical education, when the demands put on medical students are equal to the demands that are put on professional clinicians. And just to go into this, this issue of compassion fatigue, which we are changing that term to empathic distress or secondary trauma, that caregivers, which include professional and home caregivers, that is primary caregivers, family members, experience burnout, secondary trauma at rates of 40% to 80%. And medical student respondents in my country reported 76% of burnout. With these kinds of symptoms, including depersonalization and complete emotional exhaustion. And the suicide rates in my country for clinicians is not inconsequential. If you're a male physician in my country, you're 1.41 times more likely to commit suicide. And if you're a female clinician in my country, you're 2.27% more likely to commit suicide than the average female. So one gets the feeling, and this was increasingly clear to me because I began working in medical settings in 1970, that patients were not only suffering, but also clinicians were also suffering. And it really shifted the orientation in my work, the deeper I got into this stream, that it was important to actually not only do work that was involved in direct care of people who were suffering, whether in the prison system or in the end-of-life care setting, but it was important also to take care of the people who were taking care of others. And this is, a little bit different. Mostly we focused on what appear to be the most disadvantaged people. And we neglect the people who are giving care, like the mothers who care for their children. We think that mothers can just cope and then go to work. Or someone who is working with homeless people, or someone who is working in the prison system. It's very important at the strategic level to really go upstream, because we know that if we take care of the teachers, the students will be better taken care of. If we take care of the psychologists, the patients will be better taken care of. If we work with the corrections officers, there will be less violence in the prison. So this is a very different equation. Someone recently said to me, well, Roshi, why don't you sit more with dying people? And I actually sit with a lot of dying people in the course of my year. But I said, just when you're older, you become more strategic in a way. You want to go into, I don't want to lose my sort of touch or feel for working in the end-of-life care field, or going, as Martin will share his work, into the mountains of Nepal and creating schools, clinics, and so forth, which is Martin's work. We have healthcare delivery projects in the Himalayas. That's really important for me because, it's sort of what breaks my heart open first. But what breaks my heart open second is actually addressing the suffering of those who are caring for those who are suffering. So I want to seed this into your midst. Both sides of the equation are really important, but often the caregivers, the teachers, the psychologists, the clinicians are looked on as privileged, when in fact, if they were better taken care of, they could offer better care to those whom they serve. So I want to describe for you what I've termed to be 6 edge states. And these edge states apply right across the board, no matter whether you're working in addictions or homelessness or prison or so on and so forth. And these are states that cause great challenges for those who are doing this primary work of service. And the first is a very interesting concept that was articulated by a social psychologist named Michael McGrath. And this is the experience of pathological altruism. And pathological altruism refers to when you do things for other people that causes mental or physical suffering for yourself. And so there are many examples of pathological altruism, which I probably don't need to articulate, but it gives rise to a number of other edge states or issues. The next one, excuse me, is vital exhaustion, or what we know as burnout. And that is basically, if you're a mother, not having, agreements in the family system about, what you do as a mother. So you can take care of yourself, thus take better care of your children. Or if you're working in an institution, having good boundaries and good agreements so that you can stay in a state of flourishing in terms of how you give care. So burnout is a very frequent effect, and particularly in the West. I don't know how it is here in Holland, but in my country, for example, nurses and doctors are financially rewarded for working much longer hours. But the efficacy of their work is actually producing a whole population of numbed out clinicians, of people who are much less effective and more vulnerable in the workplace. Another edge state is that of vicarious trauma. And this is when you've been exposed to suffering after suffering. And for those individuals who don't have a lot of resilience, suddenly you're beginning to experience those symptoms associated with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and where just being around suffering activates and depletes you. Moral distress, I've just finished a couple of papers with some colleagues, an ethicist and a neuroscientist, on this area. It's of increasing importance. And all of us are actually familiar with this experience. For example, when our government enacts policy that is abusive to others, or when we're in a situation with a patient where we feel, for example, that the clinical decisions are actually harming the patient or harming the patient and the patient's family. And you have a very interesting system here in Holland in relation to euthanasia, to physician-assisted suicide, where there's a tremendous amount of due diligence. But still, even those individuals who are involved in this kind of decision-making process, which is done very carefully, there is inevitably the feeling of moral distress because of the moral dilemma of what it means to actually take the life of another. The next one is called horizontal and vertical hostility. And this is when there are behaviors of disrespect, either in the family system or among peers. And that disrespect is manifested in terms of behavior associated with bullying. And then finally, the sixth one is structural violence. And this is when the policy of the institutions, whether it's government or medical institution or corrections or whatever institutions are serving our society, actually engage in systemic violence toward individuals and groups. And I can give you an example of this. My first teaching job in medical school was at the University of Miami School of Medicine. And 40 years later, I was asked to come back and do grand rounds. It was like, wow, that was so interesting. And I was talking about structural violence to clinicians during grand rounds. And it was just fascinating because the head of epidemiology shared with me that the university hospital had just changed its policy in relation to individuals who were in same-sex relationships. And one of the individuals was in the intensive care unit. And it had happened that an older couple, two women, very educated, one woman had had a stroke, and her partner was not allowed into the ICU to be with her as she died. And the surviving partner was outraged and took the medical school and the hospital to task. And they got it. They did not defend themselves. They changed their policies. And these kinds of policies, which seem, I hear here in Holland, but I can tell you in my country, now that we've sanctioned same-sex marriage, but there is so much prejudice in my country in relation to these very issues that have to do with the rights of all individuals, no matter what their color is, what their preferences are, and so forth. So these 6 edge states, I think, are really important for you to explore. I always say it's good to know what the problems are first, if you know what I'm saying. And they really afflict medical people in my country, and probably they're familiar to some of you as well. Well, the work in neuroscience around compassion has opened up a very fascinating domain because, as I said, what has typically been done is that empathy and compassion have been conflated. And what we're doing now is to actually pull these two processes apart. And this has happened in part in the world of neuroscience because of Buddhism, wildly enough. That the first people where compassion was actually, measured in a fairly refined way were expert, kind of Olympian Tibetan Buddhist meditators, who were people, primarily men, who had meditated for over 10,000 hours and could turn compassion on and off. And one of the first subjects was this fantastic Frenchman, Matthieu Ricard. He had really, a really exceptional ability to drop into a state of compassion and then to go into a non-compassion state, a kind of default state. I mean, very precisely. And when you see the mapping of how he did this, it's kind of like, wow. I can sort of do it, but he's really good at it. So they've discovered a number of very interesting things about people who are able to actually cultivate or manifest principled, wholesome compassion. And some of these things are relate to high resonance between the brain and the heart, the production of gamma, which is a wave associated, which just sort of floods the brain in states of compassion, associated with consciousness and insight. very deep pro-social emotions and the neural networks associated with prosociality. And then, the conclusion, and also drops in cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And the conclusion is that, compassion is actually probably helping with our lifespan. If all of these interesting, neuroscience research endeavors are the case. Now, how compassion is trained in America is much more behaviorally, and this is this stupid cartoon. Of course I'm listening to your expression of spiritual suffering. Don't you see me making eye contact, striking an open posture, leaning towards you and nodding empathically? So there's a whole rubric of what compassion should look like, but maybe not. There's another approach to training compassion, and we really first need to understand the distinction between empathy and compassion. Empathy is a part of the process that we understand as compassion. It's a process that actually helps us lead toward compassion, but it's not compassion itself. You could say that empathy is a kind of feeling into the experience, sensing into the experience of another in a vicarious way. And one of the terms that is used for empathy is affective resonance, that you're resonating with the experience of another. Whereas compassion is a feeling for another, and that the actual experience of compassion is not necessarily isomorphic with the experience of the person who's suffering. So this is a really important distinction, because what we've learned is that people who experience empathy that is unregulated go into experiences of distress. And I want to show you, this is the work of a social psychologist, very well known, named Daniel Batson in the 1980s, who began to look at, what really motivates us to help others, what really, sort of wakes us up to want to, be of service to others. And he made two categories. One was empathic concern, and that is that when witnessing the suffering of others, that the feeling that you have is other-focused. It's not about yourself. It's not about being a good person. It's not about relieving your distress because you're witnessing suffering. It's that you actually feel the suffering of others and you want to relieve it. And it involves feelings such as sympathy or concern or kindness. The other stream that Batson identified was personal distress. And that is self-focused, that when we see the suffering of others and we go into states of empathic resonance, affective resonance, all of a sudden our feelings begin to overwhelm us, and we begin to actually try to manage the suffering of others in order to avoid our own suffering. So this is a very interesting distinction, and it's led social psychologists to look at two really important points in how we relate to the suffering of others. One of those is the importance of actually being able to regulate our emotions, whether it's a top-down regulation, whether we're actually regulating it in an intentional way, or it's kind of bottom-up. We have the means, the resilience, where we're just self-regulating naturally. The other piece that was very interesting for those of us in the field has to do with the capacity to actually distinguish in one way ourselves from others. So that, for example, I've worked in the prison system on death row and maximum security for 6 years. And it was very, very challenging work. I was saying to the people in the retreat this week that it was the kind of work that it was such a toxic physical environment and such a toxic and violent psychological environment. And that the people who are in the system, both serving in the system as correctional officers, as well as the inmates themselves, since I worked only on death row with people who were slated to be put to death, and only in what's called maximum security, which were the most difficult people in the prison system. And so it became really important to understand sometimes as I'm sitting with a death row inmate and my heart is really cracked open, even though this person has, raped and killed children, to understand, and I'm in affective resonance, how to, at a certain point, not get lost in that feeling, but to actually distinguish, this is this person, and I am this other person. I am not this person. We're deeply connected. I feel his suffering. I'm also not this person. And this has been very important for me in also working with dying people. And it seems counterintuitive because we should be, not objectifying. Well, from one point of view, we don't objectify, but from another point of view, it's kind of important to objectify. So I'm just going to open this slide up because in its entirety, this comes from or is inspired by the work of a social psychologist named Nancy Eisenberg. And what she wanted to discover is, what is the process by which people go into personal distress? And when they're bearing witness to the suffering of others. She worked primarily with kids. We translated her work into adults, people like us. And what she saw, that there were basically 3 streams that braided together. One of the streams was affective resonance, that is that feeling, that sensing into the experience of another. Another stream was cognitive resonance, or what's called perspective taking, which is being able to see out through the eyes of another. And the third stream is the stream of memories, our personal experience. And what she has found as a social psychologist is that these 3 streams combine to give rise to an arousal level that is really important. It's not that we are just to sit there, numb, or cognitively objectifying a person's suffering, that really compassion arises because there is arousal. We are really called upon to open to the world. And at the same time, if that arousal level is not regulated, what happens is that people move into personal distress. And that personal distress can manifest in 2 different ways. One of those ways is related to what is called selfish prosocial behavior. It's people who are so upregulated and tender and vulnerable, they're all running around trying to save the world at any cost. That is the pathological altruism. Or individuals who have fear responses related to fight, flight, and freeze. So fight is manifesting as moral distress. Flight is abandoning the patient or the family member or the prisoner where there's a lot of dis-ease. And freeze is those clinicians or mothers or people in the prison system who are just totally shut down, completely dissociated. But when arousal is regulated, then what arises is concern. And then from concern, what arises is compassion. So the importance of regulating our experience cannot be emphasized enough. And that is why it's so important for those of you who have practices, engage in mind training, the cultivation of bodhicitta, of an awakened heart, but also the cultivation of powerful concentration so that you're able to actually stabilize in the midst of really complex conditions. So in the light of this, I began to try to understand, seeing, how many people who work as chaplains, as clinicians, psychologists, social workers, but also teachers, mothers, try to understand how we can more effectively train others in compassion. It just was something that felt really important to me. And part of it was stimulated by a conversation that we were having in a small meeting with people like Tanya Singer, the neuroscientist in Germany, Richie Davidson, a neuroscientist in the States, Matthieu Ricard was there, the Dalai Lama. It was a small meeting looking at how we can better research this field of compassion. And Tanya made an observation which was really awakening for me. And what she shared was that people who suffer from alexithymia, which is an autism-related disorder, which is characterized by two very distinct features, which is no capacity for interoceptivity, that is really not being able to read their visceral processes, and also not being able to sense into the experience of others. And she saw that empathy and absence and interoceptivity, rather, operated from overlapping neural networks. And when she said that, it was like, for me, it was like a lightning bolt. Because what I realized so deeply is how dissociated physically many clinicians are, and certainly people working in the prison system. How medical training also dissociates nurses and doctors from their own somatic stream. So I began to develop a very simple equation, and that is interoceptivity, really practicing sensing into our own visceral processes primes our capacity to sense into the experience of others. And that, combined with positive regard, that is a sense of pro-sociality is distinct from antisocial, a sense of tenderness, concern for the world, plus insight, that these were features that made compassion possible. And from this very simple equation, because I was so fortunate to have some time to reflect on what compassion meant and to begin to work on a model of compassion that's heuristic, I asked myself the following questions. Is compassion possible without attentional and affective balance? Is it possible without having an altruistic and ethical intention, and without having fundamental insight? And is it possible without somatic engagement, somatic sensitivity, and embodiment? And so I began to work with those questions because I realized that all of these processes that I had asked in this thought experiment that I was engaging in are trainable processes, and they basically combine to give rise to compassion. And out of that came this heuristic model, which is now called in the literature the Abide model of compassion. Attention and affect give rise to balance. Intention and insight give rise to discernment. And what unfolds is embodiment and principle and active engagement. And I got carried away by the E's. Eudaimonia, which is flourishing, well-being, and also equanimity are in balance with each other. So the word abide means to live with, to accept, but really to have trust in. So we have these three domains that interact with each other. One domain, because attention and affect actually bias each other, influence each other. The second domain is more cognitively based, intention and insight. the third domain is the somatic domain. So I want to leave a little time for questions. We're good, okay. I'm almost done. I'll get you out of the PowerPoint trance in a minute. So it is essential that we engage in attentional training. And there are many ways to do this. But in order to be really grounded so that we can perceive in an unbiased way suffering, and also interoceptivity, being able to actually sense into our own visceral processes. And we now know, but of course Buddhists have long known, that affect and attention bias each other. And that the cultivation of prosociality, of positive affect, which is done in social psychology, positive psychology, and of course is very powerful stream in Buddhism, is a stream that is trainable. And we also have the capacity to be in affective resonance. And then intention, that our ethical perspective, our values, how we see the world, also our view, but also our value system influences our ethical systems, and these prime our intentionality. And that we operate from a moral imperative. In other words, and this is something, again, that was so important for us young people in the 1960s, that we have a really strong moral imperative. We want to see the end of suffering. And that as well, we develop moral sensitivity so that we can cultivate what is called in the literature moral character. And then in the area of insight, the role of metacognition is essential. That is our capacity to really step out of our experience and to watch what's happening to our own somatic, affective, and cognitive stream, because we're often easily triggered in the presence of suffering. And so we can develop through this experience of self-awareness the actual capacity to self-regulate. I talked about perspective taking and self-other attunement, also understanding things that are existential and philosophical in nature. For example, the truth of impermanence. I'm sitting with somebody who is suffering from pain that cannot be managed, and then I recognize that at some point this person will be free of pain. So I'm able to kind of regulate my response in a very heartful way. I think this is hell that this person is going through, absolute hell. And by the same token, at some point, maybe at the moment of death, they will be free of this pain. So I'm able to open myself a little bit wider in the heart. And then finally in this cognitive domain, which seems paradoxical but is really important, just as we bring the best to others, it is about not being attached to outcome. That often the futility that people in service professions experience is because the homeless person goes right back to living on the streets, shooting up drugs. The dying person is just weak clo. It's no exit for that person in how they're perceiving their situation. The man on death row calls off his appeal, and he becomes the first person to be put to death in New Mexico in 40 years. And it was under your watch that this happened. And it is, it doesn't always work out fabulously. So it is developing this kind of perspective inside that even though we bring our best to each moment, it doesn't always work out. And what causes our futility are these unrealistic expectations. We want the best, we bring the best, by the same token, driving the patient or the prisoner toward the best can cause a tremendous amount of harm, not only to the patient or prisoner, but also to ourselves. And then finally, the importance of embodiment. And I will say that really, since Tanya made that observation in this small meeting, we who have it at Upaya Zen Center, we have a training program for clinicians. 60 to 70 clinicians a year come into that program. Now hundreds have been trained. At the University of Virginia alone, over 60 clinicians have been trained in that program that we offer, and it's changed the culture of that institution. And that program's curriculum changed dramatically after Tanya's remark, because we realized how important it was that people be embodied in their process of learning. And it's nonlinear, so I won't take you into the details of this, but it's a heuristic model, but I wanted to put it in a way, in an illustration, so we really understood that this is a nonlinear process. So finally, the question arose for me of, okay, this model points towards something. Now I would like to develop an actual application. Do you know, I mean, it's just this sort of pragmatic nature. How do we actually cultivate compassion while interacting with patients or prisoners or homeless people and so forth? And this is the last little bit in my talk. It's called grace, and it stands for the following things, and I'll just put the first part of grace is our capacity to really gather our attention. Usually our attention is divided, dispersed, distracted. It's so easy for us to get lost in our thoughts, lost in our digital devices. And so what we're asked to do is to actually gather our attention and really to drop it into the body. The second part of grace is recalling our intention. You know, what it is to really remind ourselves why we're doing this, which is not to look like a great person or as a self-improvement program, but that we're here on this earth to truly be of service to others and to let, if you will, this field of ethics of the heart be a deep resource for us. So when I drop into the R of grace, I often remember my grandmother and the vow that I made to her. The A of grace is to attune first to yourself, which is exactly how clinicians and others are not trained. Usually what we're doing is we're immediately evaluating or diagnosing the other without really dropping into our somatic, affective, and cognitive stream, our body, our heart, and our mind and thought field, to see where our biases are and to see if we can move deeper than those biases to be with the other, which is attuning to the other, to what's going on in their body, to attune into how they're feeling, and to attune into how they see the world. This is really important. It's how we were not trained as psychologists or doctors or nurses, even as a mother. We don't really put our oxygen mask on first, if you will. We're immediately going to the other. But here, it's just like a pulse, an assay into what is the ground that we're perceiving from, feeling from, sensing from, and then dropping into the experience of others through this feeling of resonance. The C of grace is considering what will really serve. And it refers to this experience of insight. We haven't said anything yet. We haven't done anything yet. And for me, it means really slowing the whole process of care down. It's really dropping into a place where the intuitional aspect and also all of the expertise that we have as parents or grandparents, as addictions counselors, as people who are working in medicine or in corrections, you know, whatever it is, or people who are in your corporations, to really ask yourself before you act, before you diagnose, before you evaluate, what will really serve here? Consider what will serve. And then from this base of stable attention, ethical ground engaged, attunement with self and other, allowing insight to arise, considering what will serve, then engaging. Then to involve oneself in direct action, which might mean doing nothing, might mean saying something or saying nothing. I get everyday emails from people and on Facebook who say, well, Roshi, you know, my partner's dying, what can I say to him? You know, as if I could know, if you know what I'm saying. Really, gather your attention, recall your intention, attune to yourself, really feel into the experience of the other. Sense into what is really going to serve here, and then engage. So this is what we train clinicians in. A very simple, streamlined process. Also teachers, and wildly enough, I teach this in Japan, but not with Kanji, using the English. It's so wild. It is a process that allows you to actually, if entered into really deeply, if trained in these various domains, to have compassion primed as part of that process. And the final part of that is what we do at the conclusion of an interaction, whether it's with a dying person or a prisoner. And that is to end it in a way that's characterized by respect and dignity. Respect for yourself, though even though an accomplishment might have been nil, nothing, or very small, but to acknowledge that you have done your best, and perhaps ending it interactionally with your patient, prisoner, whomever, in a way that acknowledges the gratefulness that you feel that the person sitting across from you, standing across from you, stayed present with you in the course of this interaction. So these are three things that I wanted to introduce you to. One was the kinds of challenges that we experience in caring for others, which go from pathological altruism to being subject to structural violence. Two is to understand that compassion is actually composed of non-compassion elements, and that we can train in these non-compassion elements in order to prime compassion, in order to nourish the arising of compassion. And finally, this very streamlined intervention, which in the beginning we do very, very slowly in the training program, but becomes a kind of instantaneous thing, because not all interactions can be slowed down, but that interaction is called grace. How we can actually in vivo, in actual situations, cultivate compassion. So I thank you so much. Thank you for listening so attentively.